Did IQs just drop sharply while I was away?
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. It seems Bryan Kohberger's so-called quote-unquote criminal genius is back in vogue, doesn't it? A few weeks ago, a British professor of criminology suggested Kohberger may have staged the knife sheath. Remember that? And now somebody else is doing the same thing. So I think January 17th, David Wilson, a criminology professor at Birmingham City University in the UK, he made the suggestion that Kohberger was too smart to leave evidence behind, and that he may have done so as a tactic to pull off the perfect crime. What do you think about that idea? Now, that came about on January 17th. That's about 3 weeks ago, when we didn't know an awful lot about Bryan. Now, almost a month later, nearly 3 months after the incident, you'd imagine some of us would be getting a really decent handle on this guy. But it seems another expert in criminology also thinks Kohberger was just too much of an evil genius to leave something as vital and obvious as the knife sheath behind. Does he have a point? And so Fox News quotes John Kelly, a psychotherapist with experience interviewing serial killers, saying, if you took a pistol out of your holster, wouldn't you put it back in? Now, do you mind if I answer that question? If you took your pistol out of your holster, right, and you went into a house that had 6 people in it, and you intended killing everyone in that house, everyone in the fun house, or even if you just intended killing someone on one floor and someone else on another floor, sorry, I don't think you'd put your pistol back in the holster. What's more, if you really want to take the cowboy analogy further, I don't think you'd enter the house with your pistol or knife still in the holster or sheath either, right? Anyway, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but Kelly says, I don't know anybody who wouldn't, and if I went fishing and had to take my knife out, I would put it back in the sheath. Okay, but this isn't fishing or a cowboy movie. It's a serial knifing, right? You'd be an idiot to put your knife back into the sheath before you were done with the crime. Anyway, it goes on to say, you're such a clean vegan who's obsessive compulsive about what you eat and everything else. Just the hygiene of carrying a bloody knife around, wearing it somewhere on your person as you get out of the house. Okay, so that's how he's trying to put what I think is a round peg in a square hole. Or is it the other way around? It's a good point, because it's true. Bryan is obsessive compulsive. But I think that tells us more about his potential stalking, that side to him. And look how horrible he was with that. In terms of his surveillance, he was hardly so smart that he knew that there was a camera right around the corner of the crimes. Or, for that matter, that there was a dog in the house. Or Ethan. The timing of the crime, with old DoorDash delivery, when Xana was still awake, also doesn't speak to me of a criminal genius. Instead, it speaks to me of amateur hour. It speaks of impatience, hubris, poor attention to detail. Incidentally, the way Kohberger marked his students' papers and then his reaction to that's hardly evidence of a cool, calm, collected and calculating mind. In terms of Bryan's surveillance, he was captured 5 separate times just on the morning of the incident. That doesn't seem to be someone who's particularly careful or trying to keep someone off his scent. It seems to be instead someone who's got an arrogant idea of police incompetence. And it's not just that, he also left digital breadcrumbs connecting him to the scene on 12 additional occasions when he was apparently stalking them. Anyway, before we get to the rest of this episode, if you still haven't subscribed to this channel, maybe you should. Maybe it's time to subscribe to True Crime Rocket Science. I'm also going to be doing a live stream on Alec Baldwin. I don't know if you guys know, he's wanting the prosecutor removed from the case. There are also 44 witnesses on the witness list. and he's going to be appearing in court on, I think, the 24th of February. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit later tonight. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So if we're going to apply this whole obsessive compulsive thing, then I think we need to know how to apply it and where to apply it. I think it's one thing to be obsessive compulsive about, for example, food and cleanliness. But just think about his vehicle. When his vehicle was seen, did his vehicle seem particularly clean? And you might say, if he's obsessive compulsive about cleanliness, well, even Bryan, according to his students, was looking not very well groomed. So not well groomed that one of his students thought, of finals getting to him. So it's one thing to be clean and obsessive about food. It doesn't necessarily mean you're clean and obsessive about everything else, right? We also know that, in terms of the criminal mind, I don't think he was that attentive to details to either not take his phone with him on the night of the incident or simply to not turn it on the way back. You'd think if he was so clever that would be criminal psychology 101. Don't take your phone with you, and when you're coming back from a crime, don't turn your phone on. In terms of the evidence found at his apartment, it seems like they found quite a lot. I mean, there are, how many is it? 12, arguably 15 separate evidence items. The nitrile black glove, the Walmart receipt, the Dickies tag, the Marshall's receipts, the hair strands, the possible animal hair, the evidence possibly of blood, even on the uncased pillow. Why not just throw that away? So just those couple of things, the nitrile glove, the 3 receipts, and if that is Murphy's hair, all of those are huge boo-boos for a Washington State University's budding Moriarty, right? Moriarty was the arch villain in the Sherlock Holmes stories. Anyway, Kelly goes on to say the girl, meaning Dee, one of the survivors, didn't say anything about seeing a knife. And so it seems that Kelly is assuming from that's because there was a second knife sheath. And so he says, well, did he put it in his clothes somewhere, right? Anyway, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if you can say that Dee didn't say anything about seeing a knife. It's just not referred to in the probable cause affidavit. So I don't know if one can draw that inference. If the probable cause affidavit doesn't mention something, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It doesn't mention everything there is to mention. I don't think if it doesn't mention a knife in his hand, I mean, if he just dispatched Xana and he was sort of, the crime had been interrupted and he was making a unscheduled exit, right? He was you kind of get the idea that he was panicked and interrupted. There's a dog barking in the background, that he's not leaving at the time that suits him. He's leaving when he sort of loses his nerve, right? And so I don't think that means, if she doesn't mention that in this part of the affidavit, that means he didn't have a knife in his hand. I think it might be mentioned somewhere else. And anyway, if Dee noticed his bushy eyebrows, she likely noticed other things too. Could also be, if she noticed the knife in his hand, even noticed, because it's silver, noticed the sort of bloodiness of it. Maybe that's why she went into a room, closed the door, and sort of tried to hide away, right? Maybe she thought her life was in danger. If he'd seen her, maybe she'd come back in the house and do something to her. Anyway, the article goes on to say Kelly believes that the sheath may have been left intentionally after being wiped clean of fingerprints, but not thoroughly enough to remove the touch DNA evidence that police found on the snap. Now, that's kind of a contradiction, that he intentionally leaves the sheath behind, he wipes it clean, leaves it behind, but then they find evidence on it anyway. that suggests that it wasn't wiped clean. And I tend to imagine that he had the sheath maybe connected to a belt, and he was dressing up, and then he placed the knife in the sheath, right? And then prior to putting on nitrile gloves, prior to putting on gloves, he put the snap in place, and only after that he put the gloves on. It's also possible that the transfer was from the glove to the snap. That's also possible. But I kind of get the idea, while he was getting dressed, he was doing things step by step, and he didn't think about that particular aspect. Who would? The article goes on to say the attacker could have put the knife in a different sheath or some other sealed container and left the USMC stamped sheath behind in an effort to cast suspicion on someone with ties to the military. That's according to Kelly.
Well, that's a very entertaining story.
I don't know, I mean, what do you think? Doesn't that seem like overthinking? Doesn't it seem like a series of unlikely events taking place here? The trouble with this story is that the sheath does give away the murder weapon. I mean, the murder weapon is a K-bar knife, and the sheath is for a K-bar knife. And I hardly think without the sheath, authorities would have had much difficulty ascertaining the kind of knife it was. But you're certainly making it a lot easier to be absolutely sure that it's a K-bar knife. And if you've got a K-bar knife at home, and a friend of yours knows that, then aren't you putting yourself in danger? I mean, to be simplistic about it, law enforcement would have known that the kind of knife that inflicted these wounds was atypical, larger than usual for one. But why do you want to kind of help them out in terms of that? It's also not necessarily so clever trying to imply someone with ties to the military, because Kohberger himself had ties to the military of a sort. I mean, in high school, he was in a high school law enforcement class doing push-ups, and we know he wanted to be an Army Ranger. So, no, I think it would have been far smarter to infer that the attacker was a student. You could even try and infer that it was one of the residents of the house, or a former partygoer, someone from a local fraternity. Wouldn't that be the natural thing to think? So don't you want to help people with that? Had he taken a badge or sticker, say from a fraternity logo on it, that may have done the trick, or left some sort of cryptic fraternity logo in blood on the walls. By suggesting someone with ties to the military, this was actually inviting the investigation to go out of the neighborhood, to steer away from the rich pickings of suspects in Moscow. And as we saw, that's where the investigation and social media gravitated for the first several weeks. So why would you want to ask the investigation to not look at a University of Idaho student? Why would you want to lay the groundwork, lay the yellow brick road for that? I don't think that's very clever. Anyway, Kelly goes on to say, this is staging 101. They're going to look at this and they're going to think it's a military guy that did this. Some guy with some kind of training who lives up the road. So I'm inclined to think that it's not staging. It's a badly botched, too ambitious crime by a first-timer, an amateur. Anyway, Kelly says he may have thought this was the perfect ruse, and then he says, but he's no genius. His ruse and staging set him up to get caught. Now I must say I don't understand. Kelly, one moment is calling Kohberger a super smart genius, then a moron. So which is it? I mean, it's one thing to be academically smart, and I think Kohberger was, but we've got detailed logs of Kohberger demonstrating again and again that in the real world he had zero practical knowledge. If he can't execute in a restaurant or at the student union or when he's marking papers, how is he supposed to think on his toes in a crime? And the evidence shows the suspect didn't leave the crime scene when he was good and ready. He ran out of his crime scene prematurely. you kind of get the feeling that he lost his nerve because there was a damn dog barking, because there's a freaking guy in one of the rooms, because the victims were fighting back and the whole house was waking up. The whole thing where the suspect walks out of the house close enough for someone to see his freaking eyebrows isn't criminal genius 101, but amateur hour 101. I have the feeling because Kelly studies serial killers, he thinks everything is a strategic, tactical, and well thought out, premeditated, as in those habitual crimes. But this crime isn't a nail to the serial killer hammer. The article in Fox News dealing with this continues to say, if he had simply forgotten the knife, police may have found more DNA on the sheath along with fingerprints, according to Kelly. But because of a gag order from January 3rd, police have still not recovered the murder weapon, or as of that date. Anyway, Kelly goes on to say that could have precipitated the question, who else did you arrest? And that's referencing a rumored statement that Kohberger made to the cops when they took him into custody. That was on December 30th. And then he sort of concludes by saying, I think he had to believe that was going to lead them to somebody, some direction with a sheath there. Really? He may also have just been concerned because he drove home with his dad and police saw him with his dad. And because they broke into his parents' home, that after being whisked away, maybe he was worried that maybe they'd arrested one of his parents as well. I mean, they'd linked him to the crime via his father's DNA. Again, this is not such a sexy suggestion, but more likely, if you ask me, that's the reason he asked, did you arrest anybody else? But it turns out that Kelly's reasoning is catching on with other experts in criminology. Paul Morrow, a retired NYPD inspector who's also an attorney, calls Kelly's hypothesis not unreasonable. He also says that it looks like he may have been mentally in an altered state. Not quite sure what that means, but surely if Kohberger was this incredibly clever criminal genius, cool enough to take the sheath into the scene and leave it behind with 2 more executions to go. Bear in mind, he leaves it on the top floor and he's not quite done with what he's supposed to do. Why not leave it when he's done with everything? Anyway, the other thing is, why on earth would he allow a witness, one who could, would, and did identify him, to live, if he's so smart? How smart is that? I mean, how do you, as an expert in criminology, go down the he's so smart path when this is the finish line? He walks past a witness. She sees his eyebrows. She sees what he's wearing. She watches him walk up to and past her and out the door. And he doesn't do anything about that. He allows her to live. He allows her to identify him. That seems to me to be a fragmented approach to putting oneself in Kohberger's shoes. The other issue is, if you're going to argue how smart the suspect was, I mean, the bottom line is he was caught and charged in a month and a half, in less than 50 days. In recent true crime, the only criminal who fared worse than that, worse than Kohberger, was oil worker / mechanic Chris Watts. So if you ask me, in terms of this assessment of Kohberger being tactical, leaving behind the sheath on purpose, this is what I think.
So I made a decision and it was wrong. It was a bad call, Ripley. It was a bad call.
Bad call.
Right.
What do you think? What's your impression of this line of reasoning? One thing that I think is really fascinating is we're dealing with 2 cases in real time right now. One with a criminology student, criminology suspect, but someone with a PhD in criminology, and then at the same time a lawyer. So it's both people who are sort of practicing in the legal context that are being accused of certain crimes. And the question is, did that really help either of them? Even if you take Murdoch, do you think Murdoch's done a really great job with his knowledge as a lawyer? What do you think? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.